Kia ora, I'm Eugene Bingham, and he's
Adam Dudding. For this episode, we have an unusual little tale from the swinging 60s. It's something I stumbled across years ago. It's always kind of tickled my fancy. So we've gone and taken a closer look.
You are listening to Long Story Short, where each episode we dig into a story that we find super interesting. Sometimes it's a crime, sometimes it's a scandal.
And this one is the story of a movie that was so shocking, so outrageous, so filthy, so sexy, that all over the world, governments sent their chief censor to sit down and watch it, presumably peeking through their fingers, so they could definitively decide just how shocking, sexy, outrageous, and filthy it was. And once the censors had had a nice cup of tea and a good lie down to recover, they made their rulings. Different countries made different decisions. So some countries, total ban. Other countries, drastic cuts to the film. At one screening, they scratched out the subtitles. And in some countries, they gave it an X rating to keep impressionable children and teenagers safe. But in a small island nation at the bottom of the world, the country that Eugene and I call home, Aotearoa, New Zealand, the censor of 1967, Mr. Douglas Charles McIntosh, chose a very peculiar way to protect us all from the moral corruption of this movie. He made a ruling which basically ensured no red-blooded heterosexual couple would ever be allowed to hold hands or snog or whatever while watching this film, which is kind of weird, and we'll get into that later. But first, what was this film that in 1967 made cinema history and New Zealand history, and which saw journalists from around the globe flocking here to do stories about how weird New Zealand laws are, and also inspired many outraged letters to the editor? Well, the title of that film is exactly the kind of crucial information that would be most exciting to learn immediately after a short, revenue-generating advertisement break. And if our podcast platform hasn't injected an actual ad into your podcast feed today, you're in luck. You're going to find out even faster than everyone else. We're back.
Or perhaps we never went away.
Either way, we were talking about this film. Actually, before we get on with that, a quick warning. There will unavoidably be reasonably large amounts of swearing in this podcast, quite a few rude words, including one in about 3 seconds. Though, to be fair, it seems I don't think anyone really gives a flying fuck anymore about swearing in podcasts. So, anyway, the scene. It's 1967. We're in Cannes, in the south of France. There's a film festival on. Everybody's here. American comedian Jerry Lewis, French actor Brigitte Bardot, Italian actress Gina Lollobrigida. All the Rolling Stones are here, including Brian Jones, who at this point is still alive, plus his cool girlfriend Anita Pallenberg. So it's really a very it's a 1960s scene.
Starstruck.
Very cool. And there's a lot of attention on English actor Vanessa Redgrave, whose clothes are astounding, by the way, in the pictures I've seen. Lots of big chevron stripes and wild petal patterns. And she's here because she's a star in the new thriller from Michelangelo Antonioni called Blow Up, pretty famous movie, which is seriously risque, including some full frontal nudity. But it's actually another movie that really causes a stink at Cannes that year. It's called Ulysses. And it's an adaptation of the famous James Joyce novel, Ulysses. The book's set in Dublin, that's where James Joyce is from, and so is the movie. It's all Irish actors and locations, but the director is an American guy called Strick, Joseph Strick. And the movie has been chosen for Cannes, which is no big surprise. It's based on a novel that's already hugely famous for two main reasons. Firstly, it's a stone-cold work of literary genius, everyone agrees. And secondly, the vast majority of people who try to read it always give up because it's really hard going. Anyway, Strick is in the audience at the second screening of his film at Cannes, and it's subtitled in French. But as he watches, he realises that someone's gone through the French subtitles, and in dozens of places, they've scribbled over the rude words using a grease pencil, which is basically, that's an oldie-timey Sharpie. You can write on film. And that's a really big effort for the person with the grease pencil when you think there are 24 frames a second or thereabouts, and there are dozens of different places where people are saying rude words. Anyway, Strick loses his shit, storms up to the projectionist booth, and the way he tells it, there were 5 people there, all in tuxedos, and he says, "This is no longer the movie I made, and they've got to turn it off," and so on. And they say, "No." So he looks around and he sees the electrical switches for the cinemas over here, and he flicks them off, which really annoys the people in tuxedos. And then according to Strick, they then grab him, shove him out of the projection booth, and he falls down the stairs and breaks his foot.
I shouldn't have laughed.
You shouldn't laugh. No. The poor man got a broken foot.
Yeah.
But it is also kind of funny.
This film is dangerous. So Ulysses is already upsetting people. It's 1967, so it's a time when a lot of boundaries are being pushed in movies already, and in music and in book publishing. But the authorities haven't really caught up yet. So all over the world, censors are trying to slow down this tide of dangerous words and images. The United States tends to be pretty liberal, and they say, look, Ulysses can be shown uncut, though with an age limit. In Ireland, which is the home base, it's where it's made and all the actors come from, and where James Joyce is a national hero, the censor isn't at all amused, and the film is banned completely. And that'll remain the case for another 33 years. In the UK, somewhere in the middle, the censors demand 29 edits, so Strict does a recut, but wherever there's a word or image he's been told to remove, and I love this, he edits in silly noises and screeches or makes the whole screen go black, so viewers will know they're missing something. That's brilliant.
It's quite a move from airplane movies where they do the whole, instead of motherfucker, they say something else.
Oh.
Mother lucker or something
like
really?
That. Okay.
Yeah. Samuel Jackson says all sorts of strange things in the Pulp Fiction airplane version. Anyway.
In New Zealand, though, something really strange happens. Douglas Charles McIntosh, remember he was the chief censor, clearly takes his job very, very seriously, because he starts by reading the original 732-page novel, presumably the whole lot. Remember, this novel is famous for the fact that most readers don't get all the way through it. I didn't. In fact, I didn't even get to the start. What about you, Adam?
I got several pages in.
There you go. Oh.
I did watch the movie, though, which is kind of gives you a good sense. It's a guy in Dublin. I think we're going to get to that later.
We'll get to it. No plot. What do you call it? Spoilers, thanks. Then Mr. McIntosh arranges for 37 other people to watch the movie, and I love this lineup of the people he gets together. There's him, there's 3 other government censors, there's a lawyer, 2 Roman Catholic priests, 2 Presbyterian ministers, and there's a couple of university professors, plus some others. I guess that adds up to 37. McIntosh has assembled the nation's great and good to check out this smutty movie. Then he ums and ahs and asks everyone for their views and decides, dun, 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 that in Aotearoa, New Zealand, anyone aged 18 or over will be allowed to watch the whole damn thing without edits and without silly noises over the rude words and without anything scribbled out with a grease pencil. However, because the content is still very racy and you never know what might go on in the dark of a cinema, cinemas will only be allowed to screen the film for single-sex audiences. It's up to the cinema how they might do that. They could have, like, for example, all the men watching it on screen 3 while all the women watch it on screen 4, or at smaller cinemas, you could do alternate screenings. But either way, this is weird. And
to get a sense of just how weird, how about a super quick potted history of censorship in New Zealand?
1858. New Zealand gets its very first rules against importing indecent material.
1890s, laws are passed clarifying what's okay and what isn't okay, and the not okay stuff includes advertisements talking about venereal diseases, which is fair enough, because few things will corrupt a nation's morals more than people getting all hot and bothered reading advertisements for ointments to go on your man parts and lady parts.
Films arrive in New Zealand in the 1890s, and by 1916 there's an official censor trying to keep it clean.
In the late 30s, America is causing a problem. There's a bunch of comics from the USA are banned, and as far as we can tell, it's basically because they're violent and they're trashy, and according to one article I found, because the speech bubble lettering in this brain-rotting American trash is so small that it's ruining children's eyesight. allegedly.
Is that why we're wearing glasses? Anyway, by the 1950s, New Zealand is losing its mind about sex-crazed youth running wild in the suburbs. So a lot of censorship of movies is focused on shutting down those crazy, rebellious kids. So the biker movie The Wild One, that's banned. James Dean's Rebel Without a Cause is banned for a bit too, although it scrapes through as an R16 after an appeal. We also don't like songs that might give teenagers sexy thoughts either. So in 1955, Little Richard's Tutti Frutti was banned because it was too darn suggestive. And I'm going to read this straight so that no one gets too, worked up.
Excited.
A wop, bop, a loom bop, a lop, bam, boom.
That's pretty racy.
It is.
By the 1960s, by now, rebellion doesn't seem to be bothering the censors so much once we're into the 60s. And they're also letting more violence through. So I guess they've just given up on stemming the tide of American things coming our way. But it is the swinging 60s, and skirts are getting shorter and movies are getting kind of sexual. So most of the cuts and bans of that decade are actually because of bare flesh or depictions of sex or sexual words.
Which brings us right back to 1967, the year that the chief censor decides to make us watch the movie Ulysses in single-sex screenings.
And a quick context drop for you, 1967, the Beatles released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Israel has a 6-day war with Egypt, Jordan and Syria. And America's deep into its endless war in Vietnam. And, fun fact, in South Africa, they do the first successful human heart transplant. Big year for New Zealand too, of course. In 1967, we switch our currency from the pound to the dollar. We stop giving out free milk to children in schools, well before Thatcher did it in the UK. And what else happened in New Zealand? Pub opening hours are extended. Instead of having to go home at 6 p.m, we can now drink until 10. So big busy year for New Zealand, 1967.
So that's the world in the year Ulysses, the movie, is released. So what's all the fuss about? Why did they scratch out the subtitles at Cannes and ban it out in Ireland and cut it to ribbons in the UK and demand these crazy single-sex screenings in Aotearoa, New Zealand?
Well, this is possibly, to me, this is the most surprising bit of the whole story. So, the why. The film follows the original James Joyce novel, which was published like 45 years earlier, and it's pretty faithful to it. The director, James Strick, has said that there isn't a single word in the film that didn't come from the book. Thing is, the book is notoriously long, 732 pages, as previously revealed, more than 1,000 pages in the paperback editions. So they had to cut vast chunks of it to fit into a 2-hour movie. Apparently, Strick did contemplate keeping it all and making an 18-hour movie, but thankfully...
What is he, Peter Jackson?
Yeah. He abandoned that plan, which I think is a good call. And so in some ways, the book is super duper complicated, lots of complex language. James Joyce made up lots of words. And there are these ideas and symbols and references, and it's referring to the ancient Greek legend of Ulysses as well, and all this stuff. And literally thousands of books have been written about the book. There's academic papers and articles and all that. Actually, not thousands of books. I misread it. It's thousands of books, articles, and but anyway, you get the gist. But the thing is, the plot itself is really simple. It's one summer's day in Dublin in 1904. There's a guy called Leopold Bloom, and he walks around the city just kind of doing this and that. And meanwhile, his wife, Molly Bloom, she's back at home, and she's thinking about this and that. And also, there's another guy, Stephen Dedalus, who quits his job, and he also wanders about the city. So it's kind of 3 people in Dublin one day. And most of the book, and thus most of the movie, is recording the interior monologue of those 3, the stuff going on in their head. So there's huge amounts of voiceover. And so the reason the book and the movie were controversial is because not so much about what happens on screen, but basically because all 3 of those characters spend a lot of time thinking about sex. There is 7 minutes in, if you've got the fast forward, there is a bare bum. We see a chap from behind just as he dives into the Irish Sea. There's a bit where a woman flashes her knickers at Leopold.
Gosh.
And there's a little bit of cleavage here and there. But honestly, there's almost nothing rude actually on screen. The naughtiness is almost entirely in the soundtrack. So, if it's pornographic, it's porn for the ears, not the eyes. And so this is what all the censorship and banning and so on of the movie was all about. And I guess that's why with the French one, they weren't scratching out the pictures, they're scratching out the subtitles.
It wasn't like a grease pen on the bum.
Yeah, no. And I guess they're presuming that everybody who's watching this movie in English with French subtitles doesn't speak English and won't recognise the words fuck and shit. Anyway, so in the last half hour of the movie, especially, there's this really, really long voiceover of Molly's thoughts. So in the book, it's many, many, many pages, and they've just taken a chunk of it. And she's remembering various sexual encounters.
I was coming for about 5 minutes with my legs round.
And she also uses a couple of definitively rude words. So that's where we hear someone saying fuck and shit.
All sorts of things, fuck or shit or anything at all.
What else?
That's it.
Oh, I was waiting for the bad bits.
Honestly, that's as depraved as it gets.
Sorry, that was the pause because it was like, okay, and this is the bit where you reveal.
Yeah, no. It's
wow.
A little bit of description of sex and the words fucked and shit.
Jesus.
And it's really quite difficult to get yourself into the headspace of it being even a teeny bit shocked by this stuff now. I mean, so a couple of years ago I saw that Olivia Colman movie, Wicked Little Letters.
Oh, yeah.
Which is based on a real case from the 1920s where someone was posting obscene letters to residents of a little English town. And there is so much swearing. One British newspaper, they counted things up, and apparently that film, which actually I didn't, being over the age of 18, I didn't actually check the rating. Maybe it was R16, I don't know. But anyway, 71 fucks, 7 shits, 4 cocks, and a reasonable number of bastards, bitches, sluts, wankers, and a twat.
For good measure.
And as far as I can tell, the world, by and large, just does not care. Or I could put that differently, doesn't give a fuck. Yeah. So,
but this is, 2026, and in 1967, things were a bit different.
Yeah.
So here's what happened after the New Zealand censor made his ruling about the separate screenings for men and women. Mostly, people thought it was ridiculous. We spent a jolly afternoon going through Papers Past, which has scans of New Zealand newspapers going back to 1839. And before Ulysses turned up, you can see that people are complaining about censorship. In 1966, there's a long opinion piece in the Christchurch Press complaining about cuts being made to movies by Bergman, Polanski, Fellini and Hitchcock.
to be fair, defending Polanski hasn't aged well, but
Yeah,
carry on.
true. Then in late April 1967, there's the first report we can find about Ulysses. And it's saying that when the film lands in June, it'll be single-sex screenings. A couple of days later, there are follow-ups. It's announced that the ushers will be single-sex too, ladies for the ladies, gents for the gents. A reporter talks to an Anglican bishop who's very unhappy that the film is being shown at all. Then the reports from overseas start appearing. This is the week that James Strick gets thrown down the stairs at Cannes and breaks his foot, and I laughed, inappropriately, because of that shoving match when he saw the French subtitles, which had been scribbled out. Meanwhile, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, the letters to the editor start, and they're doozies.
I do love these. So Graham Riley writes to say he is mystified about the purpose of separating men from women. Quote, "Sir, what human emotion is so disturbing that it may not, according to the film censor, be shared by adults of each sex in one another's company? Does Ulysses provoke an emotional response so violent that it cannot be shared in the darkness of a cinema, even by a man and his wife?"
Some dude with the pen name Father of Six has a question. How do they propose to distinguish the sexes with so many long-haired males about who look like girls?
There we go. It is the 1960s. Another letter writer raises another brilliant point. How can the authorities ensure that the person a male sits next to in one theatre and the person a female sits next to in the other is not a homosexual?
Good point.
Meanwhile, over in Australia, the censor has flat out banned the movie as being indecent and obscene. So Australians are actually really quite curious about what's happening over here. A film distributor in Sydney thinks that single-sex idea is brilliant and says, somewhat patronisingly, I would say, as a New Zealander, we were very surprised that this idea, I'm not going to do accents, sorry. We were very surprised that this idea should have come from New Zealand, as we have always felt that censorship in New Zealand was not as advanced as it is here.
Do you mean to have a crack at an Australian accent? No.
And an Australian TV crew, like the world's press, is coming to check out our weird censorship. An Australian TV crew flies to Auckland to vox pop Kiwis as they queue up for the movie. This is cool. Someone else in Australia starts organising a Beat the Band tour. They say they'll fly 60 Australians over to Auckland for the weekend just to see the movie. But they only get 6 bookings, so they cancel it. And But there's other Ulysses weirdness going on kind of all over the world. In the UK, so remember the censor there demanded all those cuts, 27 for language, 2 for imagery. I guess it's the bare bum and the knickers maybe. And remember the director fought back by adding the screeching noises, all that stuff.
Yep.
So there's quite a bit of back and forth, and there's complaints about the censorship. And eventually it does get approved for screening uncut for over 16s. So the Brits kind of get there in the end, thus making British cinema history. It is the very first publicly screened movie in the UK to contain the word fuck. So there you go. And then while all that's happening, though, the film has come to the attention of a London city councillor, an aristocrat called Lady Dartmouth.
Some fun facts about Lady Dartmouth. She was stinking rich. She was the daughter of the romance novelist Barbara Cartland, and her actual name was Rain, with an E. Later, in her 40s, she had an affair and divorced and then married her lover, another aristocrat called John Spencer. John Spencer had a daughter called Diana Spencer, who would eventually kiss a frog and become Princess Diana. Diana apparently loved her stepmother Rain so very much that her nickname for her was Acid Rain.
That is kind of great.
It is. The other fun fact about Lady Dartmouth is that she was a bit of an activist. She once led a campaign against the cracked cups in the restaurants at London Airport, and another campaign for self-defence lessons for girls.
That's quite the basket of causes, isn't it?
Yeah.
Less porn, better cups, fightier girls. Anyway, so now that Ulysses has come along, Lady Dartmouth gets very worried. She fears the movie is so arousing that if it's screened, people will, quote, be making love in the streets. And the British newspapers found this kind of hilarious. After, so a reviewer for The Sun went to see it, and in her review she wrote that if the film corrupted just one teenager, she would eat one of Lady Dartmouth's hats. And I'm guessing seeing Lady Dartmouth was posh, she probably had a lot of hats, had quite big ones. It is easy to laugh at Lady Dartmouth, but it's actually not impossible she's right, because personal anecdote time. In the mid-90s, I lived in Newcastle in the north of England for a little while. Newspaper I worked was in the nightclub district near the Big Market. It's big with 2 Gs. And many was the Saturday evening when I would leave work around midnight after the second edition, and there would be hordes of always incredibly friendly young Geordies milling about, always horrifyingly underdressed in the winter months for the winter. Anyway, often there would be singing. Often someone would be weeing in a bus shelter. I'm pretty sure I saw the evidence once of somebody having pooed in a bus shelter, but anyway, mostly weeing. Other people would be chundering in the gutter. And here, this is the connection with Lady Dartmouth. Not infrequently, I would catch sight of a couple fucking in a doorway with no concern whatsoever for their conjugal privacy. So I can't know for certain whether or not, actually just because I didn't check, whether Ulysses screened in Newcastle in 1967, but I can tell you that just 30 years later, there were people literally making love in the streets. So you do the maths.
Maybe they had the book. Did you see? Maybe the book was like lying beside them.
I didn't want to pry.
Or perhaps they were drunk.
Perhaps they were just very fucking drunk.
Probably. Look, while we're on the topic of personal anecdotes, I do have one that's kind of pertinent. So,
Hit me.
About censorship. So, at one point I was in Afghanistan, and during our trip we went to have dinner with, working on a documentary. We went to have dinner at an influential person, I'll say that, their house. And we walked in. And
it wasn't Osama bin Laden, was it?
It was not Osama bin Laden. It was before the downfall of the Taliban. Anyway, in the corner of this room, there was this giant TV, took up half the wall. And the TV was playing, it was like a music video channel, like kind of Afghanistan MTV. And it featured what I thought looked like mostly Bollywood-style hits, or videos of Bollywood-style hits, except all the women were blurred from the neck down. So
digital burkas kind of thing.
Yeah, somebody had the grease pencil out. So that's how Afghan censors do their work. No grease pencils, but lots of pixelation.
Well, there you go. Fancy that. Anyway, enough personal reminiscences. Back in 1967, back with Ulysses. So about the same time that Lady Dartmouth is amusing the UK tabloids with her clutching of pearls, the British press is also quite intrigued by the single-sex screenings of Ulysses that are kicking off all the way down on the other side of the world in New Zealand. And for international listeners, if there are any, it's well established that the thing that interests New Zealanders more than just about anything else is what other people are saying about us. So I think the reports of the London Sunday Times then circled back into New Zealand press. Anyway, so when the movie opens in Auckland, a reporter from London Sunday Times phones the manager of Odeon Cinema, Mr. R. Farrow, to ask him about it. And Mr. R. Farrow tells the reporter that the demand for tickets is insane. There's one women's group has made a block booking for 90 seats. And the Sunday Times reports that the screenings down under have so far provoked, quote, neither riotous orgies nor any great crisis of morals. Apart from some early sniggers, these single-sex New Zealand audiences seem to have watched the uncut film in serious and appreciative silence. That said, there was a walkout of about a dozen women from one of the screenings, and Mr. Farrow said that one woman aged 83, actually, I don't know how he knew, she must have said, I'm 83. Anyway, had come up to him and said, you should be horsewhipped for allowing a film of this nature on the screen.
Even the scientists got involved. In Christchurch, a psychology lecturer surveys 262 cinemagoers. He asks them things like whether they think the film should have instead been shown to mixed audiences or whether it should have been banned completely. And now they've seen the movie, did it offend them? To be honest, most of his findings are pretty dull. Turns out people who go to see a controversial movie are generally in favour of people seeing controversial movies. My favourite bit, though, was the psychologist's discovery that only 10% of people had read the book Ulysses before going to see the movie, and many of them found the movie really hard to follow or said it had very little plot.
Yeah, like I said, it's three people just sort of hanging around in Dublin thinking things.
Of that 10% who read the book, did they all finish it?
I would say just about no one, because that's how it works. Look, remember, the thing about Ulysses is it's famous for A, absolute classic, B, basically pretty unreadable. And so the movie does try to do exactly the same thing. So alongside the actual things a character does, like walking on the beach or going to a funeral or popping into a pharmacy, the movie just leaps sort of without any particular transition to whatever the character is thinking about. So all of a sudden, Leopold, I think he's in the pharmacy or something, then suddenly he's in a circus tent dressed as a woman and there's a ringmaster sitting on his head. Or he's sitting on a throne and getting crowned, or in one scene, he's sitting naked on an operating table in front of a crowd of medical students.
But presumably you can't see anything.
You don't really see anything. No. That's not the bare bum. The bare bum's when somebody dies. So is this all a bit kinky? I guess it kind of is. Conventional smut for the cinema-going masses? Really kind of not. And I kind of love the idea that thousands of sexually repressed New Zealanders who've been desperately waiting for the swinging 60s to actually start here, because famously in New Zealand we're always about 10 years behind in social trends. So they queue up for the packed screenings of this movie so obscene they aren't even allowed to see it if there's anyone of the opposite sex in the building, and instead they have to sit through 2 hours of deeply intellectual literary seriousness based on a modernist classic built on academic allusions to Homer's original classic adventure written 3,000 years earlier. So given all that, I like to imagine that when it gets to the bit 1 hour 45 in, when Molly Bloom finally says fuck and shit, there'll be whooping and hollering from the stalls. Finally, something worth the ticket price.
So I think I've got a handle on why the censors had to get involved in the first place. There was a wee bit of nudity, a lot of rude words, and this was the time when the government expected the censor to protect public morals and all of that. And the whole world was still pretty anxious about obscenity and vulgarity and nudity and so on. But that still doesn't explain why the censor Douglas McIntosh made that specific decision, the one to keep the ladies and gents separated. I guess the question is exactly the one in the letter to the editor that we heard earlier.
What human emotion is so disturbing that it may not, according to the film censor, be shared by adults of each sex in one another's company? Does Ulysses provoke an emotional response so violent that it cannot be shared in the darkness of a cinema, even by a man and his wife? When you read all the old newspaper articles about McIntosh's decision, that question, the big why, is never quite answered directly, but I'll give you a hint. It was... Actually, this feels like the kind of suspenseful moment that again calls for an ad break. So, see you shortly. Hope you enjoyed the ads. Also, for income reasons, I hope there were some ads. As I was saying before I so rudely interrupted myself, the reason the censor, Douglas McIntosh, separated the girls from the boys as they watched the movie of Ulysses was the patriarchy, of course. Because life under a patriarchy tends to mean heavily gendered roles within families and workplaces and social contexts. It also tends to feature heavily gendered physical spaces, which, surprise, surprise, often have the effect of excluding women from the fun places. You know, all that dumb shit like gents staying at the table after dinner to drink whiskey and smoke cigars while the women go off and talk girl talk, or all the members-only clubs that just bar women completely. And this kind of thing used to be ubiquitous, you know, certainly well into the 60s, right up to the end of the 1960s. Women were literally not allowed in the public bars of New Zealand pubs. They could only go to the lounge bar. So when my mum and dad were in their early 20s, in the 1950s, and they'd gather with other groovy young things at the Queen's Ferry in central Auckland, talk about art and the New Zealand poet James K. Baxter and the American poet Jack Kerouac or whatever, if mum wanted to be included, the chats had to happen in the upstairs bar because women weren't allowed in the main bar downstairs. And as an added fuck you to the ladies, drinks always cost more in the lounge bar. So it's only in the 1970s, after feminists started stomping into public bars and doing sit-ins until they were served, that women are finally allowed into public bars in New Zealand. So in 1967, the idea of a single-sex public space is still quite normalised. And so is the idea that there are certain things that you could talk about in a single-sex space that you simply couldn't talk about in mixed company. I mean, the existence of the word mixed company sort of tells you about a concept which is just, it's almost fading away now.
Yeah.
But so
It's company.
I've honestly never quite understood how it works. I mean, is it because men's heads will explode if they hear women talking about periods and embroidery, or women will catch fire if they hear men talking about testicles or car engines? I don't know. I mean, that's my working theory. But at the same time, we know that this kind of thinking is obviously still alive and well. It's there in the manosphere. It's connected to the locker talk defense of Donald Trump and his grab him by the pussy stuff. You know, the idea that it's actually okay at times to be a bit rapey and misogynistic as long as you check there are no women in the room before you do it, which is obviously kind of understandable because it's like the way of the world, but it's also, what the fuck?
It's
anyway,
very odd.
That's the unspoken context from 1967. And then the censor Douglas McIntosh comes along and he watches a preview of this unusual movie about an unusual but highly regarded work of literature. And this is the bit that I really didn't get at all until I started reading all those articles. McIntosh came up with the idea of the single-sex screening not because he was a prude, but because of the opposite, basically. He thought Ulysses was a really important book. The movie was a faithful adaptation and thus also really important, and he really wanted to avoid banning it. And he didn't want to ruin it by cutting out all the fucks and shits and bare bums. So he found a compromise, which when you compare it to the total ban in Australia or Ireland, is actually kind of progressive. Everyone gets to see it. There's just that small compromise. It can't be in mixed company, whatever the hell that is. And the thing is, even though the whole idea of mixed company comes from that patriarchal context, which tends to give women a raw deal, this particular manifestation of it wasn't exactly sexist in its own right. Women can see the film. Men can see the film. Even Stevens.
McIntosh gave pretty lengthy explanations of his reasoning at the time. He said viewers should probably read the book first so they knew what to expect. Though I suspect the queues would have been a hell of a lot shorter had that happened. But he also described all the effort he'd gone to. Viewings not just for him and 3 other government censors, but also those 34 other people, including priests and ministers, a lawyer, university professor and his wife. Of all of them, apparently just 2 people reckon the film should be banned altogether, and 23 reckon segregated audiences were the way to go. But it was the 2 Catholic priests who said no. Anyway, McIntosh said, in mixed company, some of the language in the film dialogue would be regarded as indecent. The police would not necessarily prosecute if these words were used, say, among men in a hotel bar.
Which, remember, women are banned from.
Yep, and the drinks are cheaper.
Yeah.
But they would consider, this is McIntosh, but they would consider the language offensive if it were used in the public place in mixed company. I think that's a bit that's really super interesting. He's directly referencing the fact that keeping women out of public bars allows men to let rip with their filthy language. But anyway, he goes on. Without segregation of audiences, I believe the language in the film would be regarded as indecent. I believe that segregation is a small price to pay to ensure that the film can be shown to those who want to see it. So that's what happened. Mackintosh never precisely explains the magical mechanism whereby the word fuck suddenly becomes indecent to a man's ear simply because there's a woman in the room, or becomes indecent to a woman's ear simply because there's a man in the room. But yeah, I'm going to stick with our earlier theory of it's the patriarchy.
Yeah.
I do wonder, though, if after all his efforts, Mackintosh felt a bit sad that he got mocked quite so much by the newspaper letter writers and got sneered at by the London Times. And that's just about that.
Actually, there's one other little rabbit hole I'd like to jump down briefly, so if you'll forgive me. Because long before all the fuss about Ulysses the movie, there was all the original fuss of Ulysses the book. And that was a good half century earlier, like 45 years earlier. The book was published in 1922 and was swiftly banned in all English-speaking countries. But then in 1932, the publisher Random House deliberately imported a copy from France to provoke a test case. And it's the case is called, I love the name of it, United States versus one book called Ulysses. I've got no idea why they have to say one book. Anyway, and it wasn't exactly a trial. Instead, the judge read the book and the two parties filed written briefs arguing for and against it being defined as an obscene publication. It got quite involved. But what I love about this case is that the lawyer for Random House, a guy called Maurice Ernst, he argued that part of the reason that Ulysses couldn't possibly be obscene is that no one could ever get horny reading it because it was just so hard to follow. Or as he put it, the book was, I mean, I love the fact that he's arguing for bringing this book to a wider audience by arguing that, quote, it is far too tedious and labyrinthine and bewildering for the untutored, there are snobs everywhere in the story, and impressionable who might conceivably be affected by it. Such people would not get beyond the first dozen pages. In other words, the rabble in the street, the common people, are too dumb to get a hard on. I don't know. Anyway, and to prove his point about how unreadable it was, he included some of the difficult words from the book, including whelks, which that's not a very difficult word. That's just a fancy word for snails, isn't it? Whelks?
I don't know.
Yeah. Anyway, parallax. Okay. And yogi bogie box. And I think that might be one of the words that James Joyce, he just made shit up. Definitely never heard of a yogi bogie box. No. Anyway, Maurice Ernst's arguments seemed to have worked because the judge agreed that for all the sex talk in Ulysses, no one in their right mind would get turned on by it. And if a book doesn't turn you on, it's not obscene. Though, being a judge, he used fancier words. I quote, whilst in many places the effect of Ulysses on the reader undoubtedly is somewhat emetic, i.e. it makes you want to throw up, nowhere does it tend to be an aphrodisiac. It's a weird test, isn't it? Like a judge doesn't feel a stirring in his loins.
Yeah.
And so, anyway, whatever. And he concluded, in Ulysses, in spite of its unusual frankness, I do not detect anywhere the leer of the sensualist. I hold, therefore, that it is not pornographic. So the book got published in the US, sold like hotcakes, of course, given the publicity and the ban and all that stuff. And because the very clever lawyer Maurice Ernst had asked for his fee to include 5% of the royalties, he ended up stinking rich.
Smart.
I mention all this because I love the way history repeats. I think it's safe to say a good chunk of the people who flocked to the 67 movie were doing so in the hope it would be titillating. But if they'd only read up on the 1932 obscenity trial for the book, they'd know that they were far more likely to walk out of the cinema feeling confused rather than horny.
There's just one last thing, another little rabbit hole, if you will allow us. So almost all the action of Ulysses takes place in a single specific day, June 16, 1904. So June 16 is now known as Bloomsday, after the central character, Leopold Bloom. And all over the world, James Joyce fans celebrate by doing readings and performances and dressing up in Edwardian fashions, or even eating the food mentioned in the book. In Dublin,
I wonder if that's what Yogi Bogie Box is. Who knows?
Maybe.
I will do some further research.
Or what was it? The whelks? What are the snails?
Yeah, you eat whelks. Bonus episode. Anyway.
Yeah. Anyway, in Dublin itself, you can do a walking tour to the pharmacy where Bloom bought his wife a cake of lemon soap, or to the beach where that woman flashed her knickers at him. So, wherever you may be, and whenever you may be listening to this episode, if by some fluke it happens to be June 16, well, have a happy Bloomsday. That was Long Story Short. It's a Tupuronga production written and presented by me, Eugene Bingham, and by him, Adam Dudding. Connor Scott is our producer, editor, and engineer. Podcast art created by Phil Johnson. Theme tune by Anton Morgan.
Thanks for listening, and thanks as ever to the huge number of journalists who took the time to write the articles that were the basis for our research. Don't know the names, and a lot of it was a long time ago. And also, thanks to whoever it was who decided in 2001 to get thousands of old New Zealand newspapers into the Papers Past website. It's a goldmine. We're on all the usual podcast platforms, and also on YouTube and everywhere else. So please follow, subscribe, give us 5 stars, maybe write a review. Ka kite anō maua i a koe.